Welcome back to Face the Nation. A holiday never stops the news here in Washington, even if you hope it does. And that was as true as ever this week. So we'd like to welcome our panel now for some political analysis. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at the National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent for Slate and a CBS News political analyst. And Matt Viser is a national political reporter for The Washington Post. Good to have you all here at the table. Where do we start? A Thanksgiving Day subpoena for Jim Comey. We thought some of these public hearings might be over. It appears, based on what Congressman Gowdy said on our air, that at least the public forum might be. Susan, what does this mean for the case, the special counsel, and does the American public need more public hearings on this?
You think about James Comey and Loretta Lynch. They must have thought they were out of the woods when it came to subpoenas from the House Judiciary Committee that Democrats are taking over within weeks. It is hard, I think, to see this as anything but a stunt, as Republicans are about to give up power involuntarily in the House in a final effort. It is hard to see this as a really serious effort to conclude some kind of meaningful investigation.
Well, it was interesting to hear what seemed like an offer, maybe not an official one, to have this deposition be on tape and then perhaps edited and released. We'll see if that happens, Matt. I want to ask you, Ramesh, about something that happened today that isn't necessarily on the domestic front, but does play into U.S. policy, which is our closest ally just finalized its divorce from the EU. The U.K. is exiting in the months ahead. This has been really rough for Theresa May, the prime minister. What do you think this signals, though? Is this just a one-off? Is this more indicative of the kind of forces we're seeing in the world today, beyond the U.S., where institutions are being rattled a bit?
I think it's got enormous significance on a number of fronts. For one thing, Britain's departure from the EU, and even, if this deal is modified or not, it's not going to have the say it once had in the European Union. It means the European Union is going to have more tendency to be centralized, more tendency to be dominated by countries that aren't as close to us as Britain is. It has implications for whether Britain can conduct a trade agreement with us. That was discussed a lot in the run-up to Brexit, and after Brexit, this agreement seems to tie Britain's hands in its ability to do that. And more generally, there's the question of its effect on British politics. If you have a demoralized Tory party, does it help Jeremy Corbyn eventually become prime minister? And it is just one more sign of the convulsions that nationalism is causing on politics around the entire globe.
America's in search of a new best friend inside the EU, in some ways. Is that Ireland? Is that France? Who will that be? But turning back to home, I want to talk about this public spat in some ways, but really unusual, between the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts and the president over whether the courts are being politicized. Jamelle, what did you make of the president's public statement here?
It's a little strange to see the president antagonize the Chief Justice this way just after getting a justice onto the court. I think that if the president wanted to ensure that he'd have good relations as cases relevant to his presidency reach the court, he wouldn't have done this. I can see why John Roberts has decided to push back. In the very near future, there will likely be many 5-4 decisions with the conservative majority, and creating this sort of political distance between him and the president, I think he thinks may provide legitimacy to those decisions when they happen. One thing I think is worth saying is that I'm not sure that the president is necessarily wrong here, as Representative Gowdy said in his interview, that there is sort of at least an informal recognition that partisan affiliation has some weight on how justices and judges make their decisions. There is a reason, right, why Republican voters were willing to look past so much of what Trump did just to get him in office, so he could nominate judges for the federal court system. And so I think there's this way, it's been said in a variety of circumstances and contexts, how one thing about Trump is that he sort of strips the pretense from a lot in American politics. I do think this is a situation where he is kind of stripping the pretense from American politics and saying plainly that, look, the justice in the United States, while independent, also is inevitably tinged by partisanship and ideology. And he doesn't like the fact that that means that there are judges appointed by a president he opposes who will likely be an obstacle to his political agenda.
Ramesh, do you agree with that? Because some conservatives have been uncomfortable with his references to the judiciary.
So I'm going to join the Jamelle Bouie, Trey Gowdy, Donald Trump
Wow.
coalition.
I don't think I've ever thought that coalition was possible. But.
Look, I think that Chief Justice Roberts' comment about there not being Obama judges or Trump judges was more aspirational than descriptive, let's say. But I think the part of what's going on here is that the Trump administration has a very bad record in court. It has been handed a lot of defeats in court. And one thing that we should keep in mind is it's not all been Democratic appointees to the bench that have handed him those defeats. So, for example, the question of Jim Acosta's press pass, the administration lost that in court, and that was a judge that Trump himself had appointed. Timothy Kelly was a district court judge. So what he's saying is true, but I don't think it quite gets to the underlying problem, which is the judiciary as a branch has not been especially tolerant of the kind of on-the-fly, improvisational, sort of whim-driven policymaking we're seeing from this administration.
Matt, you've been looking at some of the races still going on post midterms. I know you're headed down to Mississippi, is that right?
Yeah. Mississippi has been sort of a fascinating race here. The final one, we think, of the midterms that hasn't been decided. And it's definitely taken a racial tinge to it in the wake of Cindy Hyde-Smith's comments about being willing to sit on the front row of a public hanging, and she's running against the man seeking to become the first black senator since Reconstruction there. So,
and the president is endorsing her in a tweet today, and will be at a rally in the week to come.
He's got two rallies on Tuesday, tomorrow, on Monday, the eve of the election, which is her hope is that he pulls her over the edge, and the president of the United States having to go to a race in Mississippi for two rallies on the eve of the election just shows you how close this could be and how worried Republicans may be.
You wouldn't think it'd be hard for a Republican to win the Senate race in Mississippi, but this has been a different kind of race, and we've seen such different strategies by African American candidates in the South, in the Florida and Georgia governor's races, and now in this Senate race, because there has been a feeling in Georgia and Florida that a African-American candidate can win a statewide race by appealing to African-American voters, not trying to appeal to moderate whites in the middle, which has been kind of the traditional prescription. So this will be a test about whether anything has really changed.
Well, and it's the final test. I mean, black voters were very excited about Andrew Gillum, Stacey Abrams. They came closer than a lot of people thought, but ended up losing. So this is that last one.
What's interesting is that Mike Espy will probably have to take the more traditional path. And the thing about Georgia and Florida is, while you do have large black populations, you also have a large and growing population of liberal college-educated whites. And so that helps you able to play a strategy that's more tailored to black voters, because you can kind of bring those voters along. But Mississippi doesn't have that, and in fact has a very inelastic white population that votes routinely 90-10, 95-5 for Republican candidates. And so even, I think its black population is around 44%. It's very high. It's the highest in the country. But that inelasticity in the white vote makes Espy's odds really hard, even if the gap between a loss and a win is like very narrow. Like it's maybe a couple points, but it's so inelastic and it's difficult.
Espy's people have told me that they just need to get 25 to 30% of the white vote, which tells you how different strategies are working here. If they can get black voters out in big numbers, which is hard, which is a big task in a runoff election that is taking place 5 days after Thanksgiving. Although this race has been getting a lot of attention. I think people are mobilized, and lines are long outside polling places already for absentee ballots.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We have more to talk about on the other side of it, so stay with us. We'll have more from our panel. We're back with more from our panel. I want to ask you, Ramesh, you've seen, it's rare to hear Bernie Sanders and President Trump on the same side of an issue. Generally, both are for this effort to overhaul criminal justice. There is a bill right now that is causing some sort of internecine fighting within the Republican Party. Will we actually see this move forward in the lame duck?
It's possible. One of the rare areas where we've seen bipartisan work in the entire country really has been criminal justice reform. There have been state legislatures where you've had Republicans and Democrats, Republican governors, Democratic governors coming together on this issue. President Trump, I would say, is sort of an unlikely advocate of criminal justice reform. It doesn't really fit with a lot of the other things that President Trump is talking about. But his advocacy of it and his ditching of Jeff Sessions, who as an attorney general was dead set against this, I think has really increased the chances it's going to happen.
I'm not sure I would refer to the president as an advocate, though. I tend to see this as President Trump is obsessed with wins, with getting legislative wins. And so a criminal justice bill, even if it does run counter not just to his choice of Jeff Sessions for Attorney General, but kind of like the entire tenor of his rhetoric for the past 3 years runs counter to criminal justice reform, a bill passing would count as a legislative win, and I think he would tout it. And I don't think he particularly cares about the content of that win.
He hasn't had a lot of them.
Well, there's to be fair, there's no pledge that this will go to a vote in the lame duck. Leader McConnell has said they're still reviewing whether that is possible. But it is an interesting thing to see floated at this point. Will we see, Susan, anything substantial move forward during the lame duck?
Well, we hope they fund the government, because then we won't have a shutdown. That would be one thing. You know, I think the most interesting thing where we might see some kind of revolt by Republicans on the Hill is over the Khashoggi killing. Mm-hmm. And the president's decision apparently not to punish the Saudis in a serious way for what, or not to punish the Crown Prince for what intelligence agencies have concluded was his involvement, his ordering of the murder of a Washington Post journalist. And we've seen just today Senator Mike Lee, a Republican, saying intelligence indicates this wasn't a feeling, it was a finding. We saw Senator Joni Ernst, also a Republican, saying if that's the case, something should happen, consequences should follow. On that issue, will Senate Republicans be willing to buck the president, who is quite isolated both in American politics and international politics with his stance on this issue?
Well, can they get any kind of veto-proof majority that would in some way hit the Crown Prince without severing or hurting the relationship with Saudi Arabia, a key ally?
Well, you probably need to make a choice somewhere what your priority is there. And President Trump has made a decision that he cares more about the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Do others disagree strongly enough to confront him on that? And I don't think we know the answer to that question. It'd be unlikely, not the Republican tradition on Capitol Hill, to stand up to President Trump. But I wonder about this issue, which has really kind of caught the concern, I think, of a lot of people.
And there will be conversation about the war in Yemen and U.S. support for that in some way. Any kind of conversation, as Bernie Sanders said, he had that bill, a resolution he's floating. But I want to ask you, Matt, you listen to Senator Sanders. You've been looking at 2020 candidates. Does he talk like one to you?
The fact that he's coming out with a platform for House Democrats, to sort of live by and do and trying to assert himself as a leader in the party heading into 2020, it strikes me as yes. Like he does seem very much like a candidate. The difference this time for Bernie Sanders and everybody, frankly, is the crowded field that he's going to face. Against Hillary Clinton, there was just a binary choice between two people. This time, it's not going to be that way. It's going to be the same problems that Republicans had in 2016, where you had to have two debates, an undercard debate and a main debate because there's so many candidates. But I do think these next few weeks are vitally important for every candidate thinking about running. We'll probably start to see announcements coming very shortly in the early part of next year so that people can begin their fundraising and try to post a big number in that first quarter is going to be an important distinction point. But the Democratic Party has a lot of issues to sort out, and it's going to be a crowded field.
What's so interesting about the midterm results and really the entire midterm election story is I think it sends important signals about what Democratic primary voters might be looking for in a candidate. I think that if Senator Sanders is running in 2020, not just for 2020, that he has a good chance of doing well. But some of the other people floated, former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Sherrod Brown, may find themselves at somewhat of a disadvantage because it seems what Democratic primary voters are looking for are women candidates and candidates of color. Just down the board, Democratic primary voters over the last year, if they've had a choice, if they could choose either a woman candidate or a non-white candidate and a white guy, they've almost always taken one of the other two. And that, for me, seems to suggest that as we approach 2020, you can kind of divide up the field and rate accordingly based off of identity, really. Candidates who represent diversity, who may be historic first, have, I think, an advantage or an on-paper advantage over those that don't.
Well, Democrats want somebody new, right?
Right,
Like Democrats usually do. And so that might argue for Beto O'Rourke, who would be a white man. I mean, there's some energy behind him. But I do think there is zero possibility that the Democratic ticket in 2020 would be two white men.
Oh, absolutely.
Senator Sanders also has another problem going into 2020, which is that Hillary Clinton was a very useful foil for him, as she was for Donald Trump. The contrast made the idealism of his candidacy look better. He's going to have a bunch, not just a lot of candidates in the field, but a lot of candidates who sound a little bit more like him, who are trying to bottle what he had in 2016 and use it for themselves. That's not a problem he had last time.
And in this book that Senator Sanders was on to talk about, he in many ways describes winning as not actually winning the election, but enforcing the platform of the Democratic Party more towards the progressive agenda that he, in many ways, represents. Is there more of a progressive party now? Did he win?
He did win.
Susan?
I think he did win. If you look at Medicare for All, which means different things to different candidates, that is now a centrist Democratic position to have. So I think that whatever happens with Senator Sanders, he's had a big effect. We're talking more about Senator Sanders than we are about Hillary Clinton.
And you think about the fundraising aspect of it, too, where Bernie Sanders kept touting the small dollar donations. I think that is going to be the vehicle for which a lot of candidates run. It's what Beto O'Rourke did successfully in Texas, which was forego corporate PAC money and raise money from a lot of people in small dollar amounts. And I think that's another sort of legacy of Bernie Sanders in moving the party a little bit more in that direction.
One illustration of how I think Sanders has moved the party left is that centrist members of the incoming House class have positions like expand Medicaid, have a public option, positions that during 2009, 2010 were the House Progressive Caucus positions in healthcare were what are now the centrist positions in the Democratic Party. And that alone, that right there tells
Or look
the
at
story.
the minimum wage. First Obama term, they wanted to raise it to $9. It's now not $15 is now the Democratic bid.
We're going to have to leave it there. More to talk about, of course, in the future with all of you, but we're going to be in a commercial break and on your airwaves in a moment.